The neon sign above, Diner 78, hummed a sickly yellow, casting a weak, greasy light on the rain-slicked asphalt. Detective Miles Kaelen pushed the heavy glass door open, the bell above it letting out a tired, clank thud that barely registered over the radio static in his head. He'd been up for 40 hours straight, nursing a lukewarm coffee that tasted like burnt battery acid, and chasing ghosts in the filing cabinets of the cold case unit. He wasn't even supposed to be here. He was supposed to be home, watching the rain blur the skyline, but Lieutenant Reynolds' voice on the burner phone, a voice tight with barely contained panic, had pulled him back out. "It's not a cold case anymore, Miles," Reynolds had said, skipping the pleasantries. "It's a problem." Kaelen slid into a booth, opposite his partner, Detective Serena Reyes. She looked pale, her usual fierce composure brittle at the edges. She was staring past him, out the window, at the black silhouette of the nearby state park forest, a place known for its endless, silent trails and the occasional unfortunate hiker who never came back. "The location," she said, her voice low and even, but strained. "It's where the old, missing 7 disappearances started. Exactly where the first kid vanished 20 years ago. The missing 7. A local legend. 7 people, 4 kids, 2 hikers, and a young woman driving home from college, all disappeared from the remote Blackwood County area over 3 years, each case colder than the last. No bodies. No ransom. No trace." "I know the history, Serena," Kaelen grunted, rubbing the grit from his eyes. "Tell me about this case." She pushed a manila folder across the table. Inside was a single, grainy photograph. It showed a small, wooden shack, barely more than a lean-to, deep in the woods. It looked abandoned, decayed. "Victim is Daniel Cross," she explained. "A tech blogger. Came out here 3 days ago, obsessed with proving the missing 7 was a local police cover-up. We got a ping from his emergency beacon this morning." Kaelen pulled out a crime scene report. Minimal blood. No forced entry. Just gone. "What makes this different?" Kaelen asked, flipping the page. "Another hiker who wandered off the trail." Reyes leaned forward, her eyes finally meeting his. They were wide, haunted. "The cabin isn't the key. The cabin is where we found this." She reached under the table and pulled out a large, heavy-duty evidence bag. Inside was a device that looked like it had been salvaged from a scrapyard. It was a heavy black metal box, maybe 10 inches square, covered in cheap, dusty black faux leather. There were no visible seams, no maker's mark, and only one feature, a single, oversized, tarnished brass crank on the side, like something from an antique music box or an old-timey telephone. "It's a Faraday cage," Reyes continued, tracing the plastic bag with her finger. "Custom built. Blocks all signal. But it's not a storage box. It's a receiver." "What did it receive?" Kaelen asked, his skepticism warring with a creeping sense of unease. The thing felt wrong, inert, and threatening at the same time. Daniel Cross was live streaming when he vanished. His camera rig was recording, mounted on a tripod inside the cabin. The last 20 minutes are just static, white noise. Except for the sound of this thing being cranked. Kaelen's blood ran cold. He knew the sounds of the woods, the wind, the leaves, the silence. But the sound of a mechanical crank, slowly turning, inside a dead, silent cabin. He was talking to it. "No," Reyes whispered. He was listening. The audio technician cleaned up the white noise. "There's a frequency, right on the edge of the audible range. A low, rhythmic pulse. The sound of a human heartbeat. And then, clearer than anything else, a voice." She paused, and the weight of the moment felt heavier than the humidity in the diner. The voice said 4 words, "Miles." Just 4 words, repeated once, then the feed cuts out. Kaelen's hand was shaking as he picked up the evidence bag. The brass crank felt cold, even through the plastic. "What did it say, Serena?" She didn't look at him, her gaze fixed again on the dark woods outside. It said, "You found the listening post." A chill that had nothing to do with the diner's air conditioning crawled up Kaelen's spine. The idea of a listening post, a deliberate mechanism to receive something unknown, deep in the dark, silent forest where 7 people had vanished without a trace, was unsettling. But the voice itself, the confident, calm, almost amused tone that Reyes's report implied, that was the hook. Reyes finally looked at him, her lips pressed into a thin line. "We ran the frequency. The low-end pulse. It matches the resting heart rate of the first victim, 20 years ago. The missing 12-year-old girl, Clara Vance." Kaelen gripped the edge of the table. He was no longer tired. He was awake, alert, and deeply, terribly afraid. This wasn't a cover-up. This was a line of communication. "Get a warrant for the tech blogger's apartment," Kaelen ordered, his voice suddenly sharp, cutting through the silence of the booth. "I want to know who he was talking to about the listening post. We need to know where the next signal is coming from." Reyes nodded, already pulling out her phone. Kaelen stared down at the black box in the evidence bag. The whisper box. He knew, with a sudden, sinking certainty, that they hadn't found a key to a cold case. They had found the switch to something far older and far more terrifying. The smell hit Detective Kaelen the moment Reyes used the skeleton key to bypass the complex lock on Daniel Cross's apartment door. It wasn't the metallic tang of fresh homicide, it was older, deeper, and sickly sweet, the scent of stale blood mixed with mildew and decay. "Don't touch anything yet," Kaelen commanded, pulling out a pair of latex gloves and slipping them on. Reyes was already inside, her flashlight beam cutting through the thick morning gloom of the living room. The apartment was a shrine to obsession. Every wall was covered, ceiling to floor, with corkboards, whiteboards, and printouts. It was the quintessential conspiracy war room. Threads of red string-connected faded photos, newspaper clippings of the missing 7, hand-drawn maps of the Blackwood County forest, and coded notes scrawled on post-its. He wasn't just a blogger, Miles. He was dedicated, Reyes observed, stepping carefully around stacks of forgotten takeout containers. "Look at this map. He's marked the exact spots of all 7 disappearances. They form a perfect 7-pointed star." Kaelen wasn't looking at the map. He was focused on the central corkboard. This one wasn't a collage of clippings, it was a single, disturbing piece of art. 7 photos of the missing victims, printed large and high resolution, were neatly arranged in a circle. In the center, pinned to the cork, was a small, desiccated square of animal hide, covered in symbols that looked prehistoric, but the real focal point was directly behind the board. "Serena, get the camera," Kaelen said, his voice flat. He reached up and gently, carefully, lifted the massive corkboard off its anchor screws. Behind it, scrawled into the drywall in a dark, thick, reddish-brown substance, unmistakably dried blood, was a single, ancient word, written in script that Kaelen didn't recognize. It looked Latin, or maybe even older. Nocent. The single word stared back at them, an aggressive, silent threat. "We need a sample," Reyes said, her voice shaking slightly as she brought the camera up. "And check the forensic database for that language." "It's Latin," Kaelen murmured, his eyes fixed on the bloody inscription. "But it's not a common usage. It means they harm, or those who are guilty." "Guilty of what?" Kaelen ignored her. He was staring at the lights of the apartment's ceiling. Fan light, a cheap, ugly fixture, was beginning to flicker. It wasn't random, electrical sputtering. It was a distinct, rhythmic pattern, 2 long blinks, followed by a pause, then 1 short blink, a pause, and then the cycle repeated. Flicker, flicker. Pause. Flicker. Pause. Reyes noticed it too. Electrical surge? Kaelen shook his head slowly, a sickening certainty dawning on him. He remembered the technical report on the whisper box audio. The audio tech noted the pulse, Kaelen said, walking toward the flickering light, his eyes narrowed. The low, rhythmic frequency of the recorded heartbeat. 2 long beats, 1 short beat. The resting heart rate of the first victim, Clara Vance. The 12-year-old girl. Flicker, flicker. Pause. Flicker. Pause, it's talking to us, Reyes breathed out, backing away slowly. Someone is still broadcasting on that frequency, and they know we're here. Kaelen grabbed a stack of Cross's notebooks off a nearby desk. They were filled with dense handwriting and diagrams. He flipped frantically through the pages, looking for anything related to signals, frequencies, or this bizarre flickering code. On the very last page of the final notebook, Kaelen found what he was looking for, a crudely drawn map of the Blackwood County forest, identical to the one on the corkboard. But this one had 7 circles marking the disappearance sites, and in the center, a large, dark circle marked post. Next to the post circle, Cross had scribbled a panicked note: the 7 are receivers. The box is the transmitter. The heart is the message. They are listening at the node. Below that, a single line, circled 3 times, the node is the lighthouse. Reyes had the forensics kit open now, carefully collecting a swab of the bloody inscription. A lighthouse, Miles. In the middle of the woods. Kaelen looked up at the flickering light, which suddenly stopped, plunging the apartment into a deeper, absolute silence. He looked back at the single, stark word written in blood: Nocent. The lighthouse isn't a building, Serena, Kaelen said, snapping the notebook shut. It's a code name. A location that guides others to the signal. We found the receiving shack, the whisper box. Now we need to find the transmitter. He pointed to the scribbled note on the desk. This lunatic blogger knew too much, and they took him. He thinks the 7 victims weren't just disappeared, they were receivers for some signal. And the one transmitting that signal is at the lighthouse. We are going back to Blackwood County. Kaelen felt a cold certainty grip him. The perpetrator wasn't just covering up a crime, they were controlling a frequency, broadcasting a message, and they had just used the power grid to acknowledge Kaelen and Reyes's presence. They knew their names, and they knew they had the box. Call Reynolds. Tell him we need a helicopter team and ground support for an immediate sweep of the Blackwood area, focusing on any old, tall structures, Kaelen ordered. And tell him to bring the whisper box. The box. Reyes frowned. Why? Kaelen looked at the bloody script, then back at the dark, silent forest on the map. Because if that box is a transmitter, it needs to be where it can receive, Kaelen explained, his voice low and dangerous. If the lighthouse is transmitting, the whisper box might be the only way to hear what it's saying before it's too late. Lieutenant Reynolds was furious. A 70-year-old firewatch tower. Miles, that thing is half-rotted timber and rust. If you even look at it wrong, it'll fall over. And why the hell did you bring the evidence? Kaelen ignored the sputtering on the satellite phone. He and Reyes stood at the edge of a small, forgotten clearing, the air thick with damp earth and pine needles. Above them, piercing the dense canopy of the Blackwood forest, was the towering skeleton of the old forestry firewatch. It was, indeed, the lighthouse. The metal catwalks were draped with thick, rusty chains, and the wooden stairs were missing planks. It stood silent and ominous, the highest point for miles, perfectly positioned to receive or transmit a signal. We need to get the whisper box closer, Reyes, Kaelen said, his eyes scanning the surrounding trees. If this is the transmitter, the box should react. Reyes pulled the heavy evidence bag containing the black box from her rucksack. As she did, Kaelen's burner phone, the phone only used for official, untraceable communication, vibrated violently in his pocket. He pulled it out, the screen was dark, but a single, brief text message had appeared. The sender ID was Daniel Cross's number, the tech blogger they were here to find. Look up. They are in the canopy. Kaelen froze, the phone slipping slightly in his sweaty palm. Serena, look up. They both lifted their gazes. The canopy was thick, a woven mesh of dark green and black shadows. They saw nothing. No birds. No movement. Just the silent, suffocating density of the forest roof. Then, Kaelen heard it. Not loud, but distinct. A soft, rhythmic whir-click, it was the unmistakable sound of the brass crank on the whisper box being turned. It echoed through the dense trees, impossibly close, yet impossible to locate. "The box is still in the bag, Miles." "It's right here," Reyes whispered, holding the evidence bag up. "It's an audio loop." "A recording," Kaelen reasoned, though his gut churned. "It's playing the sound of the crank to draw us in." Reyes, however, was staring at the base of the tower. If they are using that frequency to transmit a signal strong enough to power lights miles away, they need a serious power source. Kaelen followed her gaze. Strapped to the bottom, thickest wooden pillar of the Firewatch Tower was a device that looked utterly out of place. It was a massive, cylindrical metal canister, welded shut, roughly the size of a water heater, but crafted from thick, black, non-reflective material. Heavy gauge cables ran from the top of the canister, snaking up the tower's support structure and disappearing into the darkness of the high platform. "That's the core," Kaelen stated, walking toward it. "That's the node Cross wrote about." He knelt down beside the canister. There were no vents, no seams, and no obvious access panels, only a faint, pulsing heat emanating from the metal. And then he saw it, etched crudely into the canister's surface with a sharp tool, a series of repeating symbols. They were the same archaic symbols found on the animal hide in Cross's apartment. Kaelen pulled the whisper box out of the evidence bag. As soon as the box was within 3 feet of the canister, it began to sing. It wasn't the static from the initial recording. It was a low, vibrational hum, so deep it resonated in their chests. And on the surface of the black box, a fine dust, something like metallic filings, began to dance and vibrate, forming patterns. Reyes gasped. "Look at the heat sink." A small, rectangular metal plate on the side of the whisper box, a plate Kaelen hadn't paid attention to before, was beginning to turn a dull, cherry red. The box was receiving a massive surge of energy, and it was struggling to cope. Then, the high-pitched whir click of the crank started again, but this time, it was distorted, warped by the hum of the canister. And a voice, impossibly clear, cut through the noise, emanating not from the tower, but from the whisper box itself. It wasn't the calm, amused voice from the first recording. This one was strained, panicked, and young. They are making me listen. It's not radio. It's the sound of them, the 7, it's all of them. They're not gone, they're inside the frequency. Clara is screaming. They made me the antenna." The voice cut off with a wet, gurgling sound, replaced by the deep, rhythmic thump-thump-thump of the single heartbeat frequency, Clara Vance's heartbeat, but now, it was accelerated, racing at an impossible speed. Kaelen snatched the whisper box back, shoving it back into the insulated bag. The humming stopped, replaced only by the silent menace of the tower and the canister at its base. "That was Cross," Reyes said, her face pale. "That was him in his final moments. They aren't just transmitting signals. They are broadcasting the victim's trauma." Kaelen looked at the canister, the node. If the victims were the receivers, and Cross was the antenna, what did that make this core? He saw a faint, hairline crack running vertically along the canister, and emanating from the crack was a subtle, almost floral scent. "They're using something organic to power this," Kaelen muttered, pulling out his service pistol. "We are not waiting for Reynolds. We need to get inside the tower now and find out what the canister is drawing power from." Reyes nodded, unslinging her shotgun. "I'll cover the approach. You go up. But Miles, if the crank starts again, you drop that box and run." As Kaelen started up the rickety ladder, the metal protesting under his weight, he looked back at the whispering shadow of the canopy. The feeling that they were being watched didn't come from the tower, it came from the silence above, the dense, indifferent forest, waiting. Kaelen's ascent up the Firewatch Tower was a symphony of groans and creaking metal, each step a gamble against gravity and rot. He reached the narrow platform, his heart hammering against his ribs, and immediately went prone, scanning the dusty, derelict space. The cabin was surprisingly intact, but transformed into a sophisticated, horrific control room. Tables were covered in archaic-looking components, copper coils, ancient vacuum tubes, and thick, insulated cables. All the wiring converged, running down through a hole in the platform floor, feeding directly into the massive metal canister, the node. At the tower's base, this was clearly the heart of the operation. The transmitter, Kaelen moved quickly, sweeping the room. On a small, rickety shelf, tucked behind a bank of rusted dials, he found a sealed wooden crate. It was old, reinforced with iron bands, and looked like a relic from the 19th century. He pried the lid open with his knife. Inside, nestled on a bed of dry straw, were 7 small, personal items: a tarnished silver locket, identified as belonging to the missing college girl, a scratched plastic toy soldier, the 12-year-old boy, a delicate porcelain doll's eye, the second missing hiker, and a child's heart-shaped necklace, Clara Vance's necklace. These weren't just trophies. They were relics, somehow integral to the frequency. Kaelen ripped the lid completely off, turning it over to inspect the underside. Taped to the wood was a small, folded piece of thick, parchment-like paper. Kaelen unfolded it, his breath catching in his throat as he read the handwritten message. The script was identical to the bloody note in Cross's apartment. The 7 are only the beginning. The next receiver is already in position. Check your partner. The air in the Firewatch tower turned instantly cold. The blood drained from Kaelen's face. He scrambled to the edge of the platform and peered down, his eyes desperately seeking Reyes. She was standing motionless at the base of the tower, looking up at him. But her eyes were vacant, her face a mask of disturbing placidity, and in her hand, she held the whisper box. She had removed it from the evidence bag. The black box was humming, the faint, sickening vibrational song returning, and the metallic dust on its surface was vibrating, forming geometric patterns. Serena. Drop the box. Now. Kaelen roared, his voice cracking. He drew his pistol, aiming not at her, but at the black box in her hand. She didn't react to his voice. Her hands, moving with an unnatural smoothness, raised the box slowly to her ear. Her lips moved, forming silent, rapturous shapes, as if she was listening to a divine chorus. Then, her right hand moved to the tarnished brass crank. Work-click. The sound echoed through the clearing, sharp and commanding. As the crank turned, the pulsing heat from the massive metal canister at the tower's base intensified. Kaelen could smell the faint, sickly sweet scent again, stronger this time, like overripe lilies and copper. Reyes's eyes fluttered shut for a moment, and when they opened, they were no longer Reyes's eyes. They held a cold, knowing malice, a look Kaelen had only seen on the faces of true, non-repentant predators. And then, she spoke. But the voice wasn't hers. It was deeper, perfectly modulated, and strangely accented, the same calm, amused voice from the first recording. Detective Kaelen. Welcome to the lighthouse. You heard the young man. He was quite the antenna. Now your partner will transmit the final location. Kaelen, paralyzed by the horror of seeing his friend possessed, lowered his pistol slightly. What did you do to her? Let her go. The voice, speaking through Reyes, chuckled, a dry, papery sound. She is not gone. She is simply listening. And now, she is relaying the instruction. Reyes reached inside her own tactical vest, not for her shotgun, but for a small, folded map of Blackwood County that she always carried. With careful, deliberate movements, she unfolded it on the ground. Then, still holding the whisper box to her ear, she used the sharp tip of a discarded rifle cartridge to stab violently into the map, pinning it in place. She made 3 deep, precise cuts into the paper, forming a large, jagged X over a remote, unmapped location known locally as the Tangle. The final resting place of the transmission core, the voice hissed through Reyes's lips. Where the 7 must sleep for the signal to be absolute. And the signal requires 8. Reyes dropped the map. She dropped the rifle cartridge, and then, she leveled her shotgun directly at Kaelen, standing 80 feet above her on the rickety platform. Her movements were fluid, professional, chillingly practiced. The lighthouse is closing transmission, detective, the voice concluded, the amusement gone, replaced by icy finality. And you are too close to the node. It needs the power back. Before Kaelen could react, Reyes fired the shotgun. The blast roared, sending a cloud of splinters and dust into the air. The heavy metal slugs didn't hit Kaelen, but they tore through the wooden support beam holding up the corner of the Firewatch platform. The already compromised structure screamed in protest. the whole tower began to tilt, slowly at first, then rapidly, the sound of tearing wood and shrieking metal drowning out the gentle, demonic hum of the whisper box. Kaelen grabbed the wooden crate and his pistol. The platform beneath his feet was already collapsing. He knew he had seconds to escape, and his partner, now fully controlled by the transmitter's frequency, was actively trying to kill him. The air was filled with the deafening sound of splintering timber and twisting metal. Kaelen threw himself toward the central ladder well as the firewatch tower pitched violently to the west. He slid down the thick main support cable just as the platform he'd been standing on slammed into the earth 80 feet below, exploding into a cloud of rust and dust. He hit the forest floor hard, the impact jarring his teeth. He lay there for a moment, winded, the faint echo of the crash still ringing in his ears. He scrambled back to his feet, clutching his service pistol and the wooden crate containing the victim's relics. Reyes was gone, the clearing was empty, the only movement the rising dust and the slow, rhythmic sway of the remaining cables on the half-collapsed tower. She had followed the instruction, vanishing into the dense, dark thicket to the east, the area marked on her map as the Tangle. She was heading to the final resting place. Kaelen knew he couldn't chase her yet. Not alone, and certainly not without understanding what had just happened. He had to assume she was fully compromised, a controlled conduit for whatever entity was transmitting the signal. He retrieved his rucksack and the satellite phone, which had mercifully survived the collapse. He didn't call Reynolds, the situation was beyond police protocols now. He needed to figure out what was inside the canister and what the relics meant. He located an abandoned, dilapidated ranger station a half-mile away, nestled beside a dried-up stream bed. It was marginally safer than the open forest. Inside, Kaelen dumped the contents of the crate onto a grimy wooden table. The 7 personal items lay before him, pathetic anchors to 7 shattered lives. He focused on the tarnished silver locket belonging to Sarah Jenkins, the college girl who vanished 16 years ago. It was heavy for its size. He fiddled with the clasp, but it seemed permanently fused shut by age and corrosion. Using the tip of his knife, Kaelen finally managed to pry open the back plate, revealing a tiny, hidden compartment he hadn't seen before. Inside, curled tightly and preserved by the silver, was a minuscule, hand-drawn schematic on a brittle piece of tracing paper. Kaelen carefully unrolled it. It was a detailed, anatomically accurate diagram of the inner human ear, rendered in fine, precise lines. But there was a shocking modification. Where the cochlea should have been, the diagram showed a small, tightly wrapped copper coil. Underneath the drawing, written in the same unfamiliar, tight hand, was a caption that made Kaelen's stomach clench. The coileteer, FORABSOLUTERECEPTION. Kaelen stared at the diagram, a horrifying realization dawning on him. The whisper box wasn't the master transmitter, it was a diagnostic tool. It didn't transmit the sound, it received and amplified the sound from a living antenna. The real horror wasn't a signal sent from a tower, it was a signal received by the victims. The 7 missing people weren't just vanished, they had been surgically altered. Their inner ears replaced by a copper coil to act as an internal receiver, permanently tuned to a specific frequency. And when the perpetrator wanted to communicate, or perhaps simply keep them dormant, they used the frequency to broadcast a specific rhythmic sound, the heartbeat, right into their minds. This explained Daniel Cross's final, frantic message, "They made me the antenna." And it explained Reyes's vacant, receptive state. The frequency had found a new, 8th receiver, a person without a coiled ear, but whose mind had been broken by the sheer force of the signal from the whisper box. Kaelen grabbed the box from his bag, looking at the fine metallic dust now clinging to its surface. The box amplified the sound the receivers were getting, bringing the inaudible transmission into the visible and audible range. The whisper box showed what the receiver was hearing. He needed to check the others. He picked up Clara Vance's heart-shaped necklace. He felt along the edges and found a similar hidden latch. He opened it, expecting another schematic. Instead, the necklace contained a small, desiccated square of animal hide, identical to the one found in Cross's apartment, covered in the same prehistoric symbols. But this one had a faint smear of dried, reddish-brown substance on it. Kaelen sniffed it, the same sickly sweet floral scent he smelled near the node. He knew what he was smelling, the power source. Something organic, something harvested. Kaelen's thoughts raced. The perpetrator has 8 receivers now, 7 biological, and 1, Reyes, temporarily controlled by the box. The location in the tangle must be where the receivers are being kept, or perhaps where the ultimate signal is being broadcast from. He pulled out his map and located the jagged X Reyes had marked. It was an old logging quarry, known for its deep, vertical cuts into the bedrock. A perfect, inescapable pit. Kaelen knew he had to stop the transmission before Reyes reached the tangle. If she was meant to be the 8th to complete the signal, it meant the perpetrator was about to broadcast something far more devastating than a single heartbeat. He picked up the whisper box. He needed to understand the signal before he went to the tangle. He gently turned the brass crank himself, the metal cold and foreboding beneath his touch. The low hum returned. But this time, it wasn't the frantic heartbeat. It was a low, undulating sound, like a choir of thousands singing a single, sustained low note. A sound of absolute, overwhelming suffering, and then, a new voice cut through, clear, crisp, and terrifyingly close. It was the same calm, amused voice from the first transmission, now speaking directly through the box, addressing Kaelen by name. "The signal is ready, Detective Kaelen. The tangle awaits its final ingredient. Do you hear them? The suffering is the frequency. And it is about to be shared with the world." The sound that poured from the whisper box was not merely audio, it was raw, concentrated agony, a choir of souls trapped in perpetual terror. Kaelen slammed the box down on the table, clutching his head, fighting the sudden, overwhelming urge to weep and curl into a fetal position. This was the suffering frequency, a sonic weapon designed to instill absolute, crippling despair. The amused, composed voice cut through the cacophony once more, sharper and colder. "You hear the source, Detective. The tangle is simply the amplifier. In 3 hours, the signal will broadcast globally, turning every mind into an open receiver. Imagine a world where fear is the only language." Kaelen forced himself to breathe, pushing the debilitating wave of terror back with sheer force of will. He stared at the box, then at the coiled ear schematic. The perpetrator didn't want to hide the bodies. They wanted the victims to be living, suffering batteries for a psychological broadcast. "I won't let you," Kaelen choked out, his voice hoarse. "You can't stop the frequency," the voice replied, tinged with mock pity. "The tangle is too deep. The node is too powerful. You will only join the chorus." Kaelen looked around the derelict ranger station. They had no weapons against a signal, no time for backup. He had to fight frequency with frequency. If the whisper box could receive and amplify the signal, perhaps it could be forced to transmit something else, something to disrupt the core frequency. He needed a massive, violent surge of power. He remembered seeing a massive, high-tension power line feeding the old, defunct logging camp a quarter-mile back down the road. Kaelen grabbed a pair of lineman's gloves from the station's dusty supply closet and salvaged a length of thick copper wire. He had to overload the box, turn the receiver into an incinerating transmitter, and burn out the frequency before it reached the global threshold. He raced out of the station, the whisper box tucked into his rucksack, the faint, maddening hum vibrating against his spine. When he reached the power line support tower, the sheer, raw power humming through the thick cables was palpable. He stood at the base, heart pounding, sweat mixing with the cold dread. Before beginning the deadly task, he pulled the whisper box out for a final examination. He needed to find the input terminal. As he rotated the box, his thumb brushed against the oversized brass crank. He stopped. On the underside of the crank, the part usually pressed against the full leather casing, was a tiny, deeply etched inscription, only visible when the crank was turned precisely 90 degrees. It was a Latin phrase, Recivi Orprescia warning. A failsafe. The box was designed to accept the signal, but if the user tried to defy it, it had a defense mechanism. Kaelen hesitated for only a second. Reyes was a receiver now. The world was about to be won. He had no choice. He looped one end of the copper wire around the metal heat sink on the box and began climbing the ladder toward the lowest active power line, a thick, humming artery carrying thousands of volts. He reached the line, his gloved hand hovering over the bare, crackling cable. He wrapped the other end of the copper wire around his gloved hand. One touch, and the surge would either stop the signal or kill him. He took a final, deep breath, tightened his grip, and touched the wire to the live power line. The resulting flash of blue-white electrical energy was blinding. The current screamed through the copper cable and slammed into the whisper box. The box didn't explode. Instead, it began to vibrate with impossible intensity. The humming turned into a high-pitched, piercing shriek. The brass crank began to spin violently on its own, a blur of motion, turning faster and faster. Kaelen cried out as the heat sink became instantly searing, burning through his thick gloves, and then, the sound changed. The amused, composed voice was gone. In its place, a torrent of voices, the voices of the 7 victims, all screaming simultaneously, directly inside Kaelen's mind. Bypassing his ears entirely, the pain won't stop. He makes us listen. The coil burns. It's cold. He's coming back. He's always coming back for the sound. Find the source. The heart of the tangle. He made me watch my own eyes change. Save U.S. Detective. The sheer psychic trauma was overwhelming. Kaelen felt blood trickle from his nose and ears. The voices were a physical presence, tearing at his sanity, forcing him to witness their endless torment. The receiver-bridge defense mechanism was active, channeling the victim's collective trauma directly into the attacker. Just as Kaelen felt his grip slipping, one voice cut through the screaming torrent: Clara Vance, the first victim, the girl whose heartbeat defined the frequency. The source is not the man. The source is the tree. It drinks the sound. You must feed the tree. Burn it. Burn the power. With a final, desperate surge of adrenaline, Kaelen ripped the copper wire from the power line. The connection snapped. The screaming voices cut out, replaced by ringing silence. The brass crank instantly stopped spinning. The whisper box fell from his scorched hand, dangling uselessly on the copper wire. Kaelen clung to the ladder, shaking uncontrollably, his mind reeling from the psychic assault. He had failed to destroy the frequency, but he hadn't perished. And he had received a final, critical piece of intelligence. The perpetrator was not the source, the tree was. He looked down at the whisper box, now smoking faintly. It was damaged, inert, but still intact. It had resisted the surge. Kaelen knew what he had to do. He couldn't stop the signal by destroying the box. He had to find this tree in the tangle, the true source of the power and the frequency, and destroy it. He climbed back down the ladder, retrieved the box, and looked toward the dark, twisted silhouette of the tangle. Reyes was heading there, likely under orders to sacrifice herself to the tree. He had to catch her before she became the 8th and final permanent battery. Kaelen moved toward the tangle with a renewed, grim determination. His head pounded, his ears still ringing from the psychic overload, but the victim's final scream, "The source is the tree," had given him a focus beyond simple panic. The tangle was not a forest, it was a scar on the earth. A deep, forbidding canyon carved by decades of quarrying operations, resulting in sheer, vertical rock faces plunging down into shadow. The air here was colder, damper, and strangely stagnant. As he reached the lip of the quarry, Kaelen noticed something disturbing placed neatly on a large, flat slab of shale. It was a metal case, clearly modern, but designed to look antique, a surgical tool kit. Kaelen approached cautiously. The kit was open, its velvet lining now stained with fresh, dark blood. Inside, laid out in an unnervingly pristine manner, were a series of specialized instruments, finely honed scalpels, delicate bone saws, a miniature vise, and several surgical retractors, tools clearly designed for the tiny, precise work of the inner ear. This confirmed Kaelen's worst fear: the coiled ear schematic was real. The victims were not kidnapped, they were surgically and brutally modified. He focused on the final, disturbing item in the kit, a small, hand-painted portrait on ivory. It depicted a stern, intensely focused man with sharp eyes and a neatly trimmed beard, wearing the high-collared, gray uniform of a Confederate surgeon from the American Civil War era. On the back of the portrait, a name was meticulously inked: Dr. Elias Thorne. CSA Kaelen instantly recalled the name from the local history archives. Dr. Elias Thorne was a dark footnote in the Civil War. He had operated a field hospital in this very area, known for his macabre and experimental procedures focused on pain tolerance and sensory manipulation, often using sound and extreme frequencies on wounded soldiers. He was whispered to have vanished into the Blackwood forest after the war ended, Chased out by horrified locals, the man behind the whisper box was not an isolated lunatic. He was an heir to a generations-old, terrifying legacy. The nascent inscription in the apartment and the ancient symbols in the relics likely belonged to Thorne's twisted philosophy. The signal is not modern. It's an ancient technology refined by a madman. Kaelen scanned the canyon floor far below. It was a maze of sharp shadows and discarded logging equipment. The only way down was a narrow, treacherous path hugging the sheer rock face. Just as Kaelen started down the path, he heard it. It wasn't the frantic screaming of the receivers, nor the composed hiss of the antagonist. It was a melody, thin and clear, echoing up from the depths of the quarry. It was a simple, childlike lullaby. Kaelen recognized it immediately. It was the same song Clara Vance, the first victim, was rumored to sing to her younger brother, a detail mentioned in her decades-old missing person file. The melody was coming from Reyes, and the voice singing it was calm, melodic, and chillingly devoid of emotion. It was confirmation. Reyes was now a fully controlled conduit, not fighting the frequency, but serving it. She was heading to the tree to become the 8th permanent receiver. He quickened his pace, the surgical toolkit and the portrait of Dr. Thorne chilling him to the bone. The man he was hunting was playing a long game, a family legacy of turning human misery into a consumable frequency. As Kaelen reached a small, flat landing about halfway down the path, the singing abruptly stopped. Reyes's voice, now tight with focused command, replaced the lullaby. "He's here. The detective has arrived, master. He carries the box." The voice was amplified, echoing around the sheer walls of the quarry. The perpetrator, Thorne's heir, was communicating directly with Reyes, and Reyes was warning him. Kaelen flattened himself against the cold rock. "The box is damaged," a new voice, the calm, amused voice of the transmitter, replied, its tone utterly unconcerned. "It has been exposed to chaos. It is now unstable. Miles. It will bring the chaos to you." Suddenly, the whisper box in Kaelen's rucksack began to vibrate violently. It wasn't the electrical hum this time, it was a rhythmic, forceful thud-thud-thud, a pulse that felt like a sledgehammer hitting his ribs. Kaelen yanked the rucksack off. He unzipped the pouch and looked inside. The brass crank on the box was rattling, vibrating with such force that it was carving faint scorch marks into the casing. The pulse intensified, and Kaelen recognized it. It was the combined, accelerated heartbeat of all 7 original victims, beating together in a frenzy of terror. Then, from the canyon floor below, Reyes's voice rang out, "Closer now. The master has commanded it, Miles. The whisper box is unstable. If you open it, the chaos of the 7 will tear your mind apart before you even reach the tree." Kaelen had a choice: abandon the box, which held the only chance of countering the frequency, or carry it and risk instant, psychic collapse. He looked at the vast, silent, terrifying depth of the tangle, then back at the small, sturdy box. He closed his eyes, grabbed the rucksack, and continued his descent. He needed the box. He needed the chaos. He had to find the tree. Kaelen reached the bottom of the Tangle Canyon. The air here was heavy, cold, and carried the sickly sweet, floral scent of the organic power source. The pulse of the whisper box in his rucksack hammered against his back, a violent, disorienting rhythm that threatened to shatter his focus. The canyon floor opened into a vast, shadow-drenched clearing. And in the center of the clearing stood the tree. It wasn't a living tree. It was the massive, petrified stump of an ancient giant, hundreds of feet wide, its roots thick as pythons fused deep into the quarry's granite bedrock. It was utterly silent, absorbing all sound and light, radiating an unnatural coldness. Standing directly before the stump was Detective Reyes. She was completely still, her shotgun now resting at her feet. She looked like a statue carved from ice, her face serene, fixed on the stump. "Serena," Kaelen tried, his voice hoarse. She didn't react to her name. Her arm slowly lifted, her finger pointing to the base of the petrified stump. In the stump's heart, a newly excavated hole had been dug, deep into the ancient wood. The interior of the hole wasn't rock or dirt, it was a deep, pulsating purple cavity, lined with a membrane that seemed to throb with the same frantic rhythm as the whisper box in Kaelen's bag. The core of the node, a calm voice stated from the shadows. A figure stepped out from behind the stump. He was a man in his late 40s, slight of build, with meticulous gray hair and a pair of unsettlingly serene, pale blue eyes. He wore an immaculate, if slightly dusty, white lab coat over normal clothes. He looked less like a madman and more like a fastidious university professor. "Detective Kaelen," the man said, offering a small, polite nod. "I am Dr. Adrian Thorne. Great-great-grandson of Elias Thorne. The torch, as they say, has been passed." Kaelen ignored the pleasantries, pulling his pistol. "Where are the 7? What is that thing?" Thorne smiled, a practiced, chilling curve of the lips. "The 7 are well. They are the permanent receivers, sealed in the root structure, acting as organic resonators. They are quite efficient at channeling the suffering frequency. This," he gestured toward the throbbing purple cavity, "is the sympathetic resonator. The amplification chamber." Thorne's gaze flicked to Reyes. "Serena is the final component. The 8th. She will complete the primary circuit, ensuring the global broadcast is strong enough to pierce the collective unconscious. A truly elegant design." Kaelen kept his pistol steady. "Release her. Shut down the frequency." "I can't do that, Detective," Thorne replied, shaking his head gently. "The process is irreversible once the 8th circuit is closed. And I require your box, Miles." Thorne produced a small, modern-looking remote device from his lab coat pocket. He pressed a single button. Instantly, the whisper box in Kaelen's rucksack roared to life. The brass crank began spinning violently again, the metal shrieking, and the terrifying chaos of the 7 victims' voices flooded Kaelen's mind. It was 10 times worse than before, overwhelming his senses, forcing him to his knees. "He made us the sound. The coil is burning. Kill the tree. Kill the tree." The box, you see, has a secondary remote access terminal, tuned to its specific resonance, Thorne explained, watching Kaelen writhe on the ground with detached academic interest. "Now you must listen, Detective. You must feel the despair before you become a part of the audience." As Kaelen struggled against the psychic assault, Thorne walked over to the stationary Reyes. He placed a gentle, patronizing hand on her shoulder. "It is time, my dear," Thorne murmured. "Complete the circuit." Reyes, her eyes still vacant, reached down, picked up the shotgun, and with terrifying speed, used the butt of the weapon to smash the face of the sympathetic resonator. The purple membrane tore open. From the gaping wound, thick, black fluid, the same reddish-brown substance found at Cross's apartment, began to bubble and ooze. Kaelen, fighting the mind-shattering sound, saw the true horror inside the cavity. It wasn't just organic matter, it was interwoven human tissue, pulsing with a furious, accelerated beat. The 7 victims were not in the roots, they were part of the roots, their surgically altered bodies fused into the sympathetic resonator itself. Reyes then turned the shotgun and placed the twin barrels directly against her own temple. "The primary circuit requires a final, absolute sacrifice, Detective," Thorne noted, his voice laced with triumph. "An untainted mind, broken and then merged with the frequency. Farewell, Miles." Kaelen knew he had seconds. If Reyes pulled the trigger, the 8th and final circuit would close, the signal would reach its terrifying peak, and the world would be plunged into absolute terror. He had to use the chaos to his advantage. He lunged for his rucksack, fighting through the searing pain in his mind, and yanked the whisper box out, holding the still-spinning crank in his hands. The psychic assault from the whisper box was an overwhelming torrent, threatening to reduce Kaelen's mind to fragmented noise. The screams of the 7, the combined, frantic heartbeat, reached a catastrophic crescendo. Dr. Adrian Thorne watched with an expression of clinical satisfaction as Reyes placed the twin barrels of the shotgun against her own temple. Kaelen knew the final ingredient wasn't death, it was the sound of absolute psychological breaking point, channeled through the 8th receiver. Fighting through the deluge of agonizing voices, Kaelen snatched the violently spinning whisper box. The metal was burning his hands, but he ignored the pain. The chaos wasn't just noise, it was the raw, emotional feedback of the 7. It was their trapped consciousness. He had to focus the chaos. He brought the spinning crank close to his mouth and screamed the only name he knew that anchored the frequency, the name of the first victim. Clara Vance. The instant he screamed the name, the box's energy shifted. The screaming of the 6 other victims momentarily faded, and a single, high-pitched wail, Clara's voice, cut through the noise, clear and sharp. The convergence was critical. Reyes, standing motionless with the gun pressed to her head, suddenly gasped. Her eyes, which had been vacant, flickered with a brief, agonizing moment of recognition. M. Miles. She choked out, her voice barely a whisper. The control was momentarily broken. The pure, chaotic recognition was overriding the frequency. Reyes's hand trembled violently, and the shotgun fell to the ground, clattering uselessly on the stone. Thorne's composure instantly shattered. No. That's impossible. You cannot disrupt the primary anchor. Thorne lunged toward Reyes, abandoning his remote device. Kaelen seized the moment. He rushed forward, ignoring the agonizing screams now returning in full force from the box. He ran past the struggling figures of Thorne and Reyes, toward the massive petrified stump and the throbbing, pulsating wound of the sympathetic resonator. The purple membrane, ripped open by Reyes, was oozing thick, black, blood-like fluid. Kaelen drove the violently spinning brass crank of the whisper box directly into the hole, plunging it deep into the festering, organic core of the resonator. FZZZZZZT-crack. The energy transfer was explosive. The unstable, chaotic power of the whisper box, fueled by the agony of the 7 and supercharged by the power line surge, backflowed instantly and violently into the sympathetic resonator. The tree screamed. The sound was not human, it was a deep, resonating groan that shook the canyon, a sound that felt like the earth itself was tearing apart. The thick, black fluid erupted from the cavity, spraying everywhere. The purple membrane lining the resonator began to rupture violently. Veins of white-hot light snaked across the surface of the ancient wood, and the frantic heartbeat frequency inside Kaelen's head stuttered, slowing, breaking apart. Thorne, now staggering backward from the immense psychic backlash, stared at the catastrophic failure of his life's work. You've broken the cycle. Thorne shrieked, his composure completely gone, his face a mask of twisted rage and despair. The resonance is destabilizing. The frequency is turning inward. Kaelen ripped the box back out. The brass crank was now smoking and warped, the box inert, silent. It had survived the power line, but the chaotic backflow had destroyed its internal mechanism. Thorne, his eyes burning with fanaticism, charged Kaelen, pulling a scalpel from his lab coat. The signal must be preserved. The suffering must continue. Kaelen sidestepped the frantic attack and slammed the now inert, heavy black whisper box with full force into the side of Thorne's head. Thorne collapsed onto the black, sticky fluid, unconscious. Kaelen staggered over to Reyes. She was gasping for air, clutching her head, the control mechanism broken. Miles, the roots, they're still alive. She whispered, pointing weakly at the sympathetic resonator. The backflow had ruptured the primary structure, but the deep roots, where the 7 victims' bodies were fused, were still pulsating, still beating, albeit faintly. The suffering frequency was damaged, not destroyed. Kaelen looked at the chaos, the inert box, the unconscious Thorne, and the still pulsating resonator. He knew exactly what he had to do to end Thorne's legacy forever. The sympathetic resonator was dying. The chaotic energy backflow had ruptured the cavity, and the massive, petrified stump was tearing apart, releasing great plumes of steam that smelled of scorched earth and spoiled flowers. However, the deep root structure, still holding the fused bodies of the 7 victims, continued to pulse, maintaining a low, erratic heartbeat. The frequency was wounded, not dead. Serena, can you move? Kaelen demanded, kneeling beside his partner. Reyes pushed herself onto her elbows, her face pale but her eyes clear, burning with cold fury. I'm in pain, but I'm back. He used the box to turn my own panic against me. I'll cover the fanatic. She grabbed her fallen shotgun and leveled it at the prone figure of Adrian Thorne. The frequency isn't destroyed, Kaelen stated, glancing at the inert whisper box. The box is dead. The resonator is still alive in the roots. We need to incinerate the organic core completely. Kaelen knew there was only one source of power strong enough, the high-tension power line he had just escaped from. But he couldn't connect the wire directly to the roots without something to focus the thousands of volts. He looked at the wreckage of the fire watch tower and spotted the massive cylindrical metal canister, the node, that had housed the transmitter core. I need to dismantle the node. That casing can channel the power, Kaelen ordered. Guard him. Do not let him near the roots. Kaelen sprinted back toward the collapsed tower. He found the node mostly intact, resting amidst the splintered timber. He used a demolition tool from his rucksack to violently peel back the thick metal casing, working frantically against the clock. Inside the casing was the horrifying sight of the organic core, a mass of fibrous, pulsating tissue, connected by thick, biological wiring that still hummed with faint power. The core smelled strongly of the sickly sweet floral scent. This was the harvested battery that powered the entire operation. Kaelen worked quickly, pulling out the power cables he'd salvaged and rigging them to the node's input ports. He connected the other ends of the cable to the massive power line leading back toward the ranger station. He ran the wire back down to the quarry floor, positioning the node right next to the ruptured resonator. He had created a colossal, high-voltage defibrillator. Serena. Stand clear. Kaelen yelled, grabbing the final exposed wire that would complete the circuit, the wire that would send thousands of volts surging through the node and into the resonator. He took a final, deep breath, his gloved hand hovering over the connection point. Just as he was about to make contact, a calm, chilling voice spoke from behind him. You are so predictable, Detective. Kaelen spun around. Adrian Thorne was standing, swaying slightly, but his eyes were wide, clear, and filled with a cold, triumphant malice. Reyes was crumpled on the ground behind him, the butt of the shotgun having been slammed against her head. A simple blow to the head won't stop a Thorne, Thorne sneered, wiping a trickle of black fluid, the resonator's fluid, from his chin. We are the true masters of sound. I let you think you destroyed my box. I let you think you won. Thorne opened his lab coat. Across his chest, stitched directly into his skin with crude, black surgical thread, was an intricate lattice of fine copper wire. The wire led down his body and disappeared into his trousers. The ultimate antenna, Miles, Thorne hissed, his eyes burning with fanaticism. My great-great-grandfather refined the technique, but I perfected it. The victims are the receivers. The tree is the amplifier. But I am the permanent, final transmitter. Thorne raised his hands and closed his eyes. The ambient air around him began to distort, shimmering with invisible frequency waves. I don't need the box anymore, Detective. I have the entire network in my mind. And I will broadcast the final, devastating frequency now. Kaelen realized the horror. Thorne wasn't just controlling the frequency, he was the frequency. He had surgically wired himself into the system, the ultimate, self-sacrificing transmitter, ready to flood the world with his mind's absolute terror and despair. You're insane, Kaelen whispered, raising his pistol. I am necessary, Thorne countered, his voice now layered with the faint, rhythmic sound of the heartbeat frequency. And I am faster. Thorne lunged toward the sympathetic resonator, aiming to touch the exposed, living roots and close the circuit through himself. Kaelen fired. The shot roared in the enclosed space, tearing through Thorne's leg. Thorne stumbled but kept crawling toward the roots. It's too late. The transfer has begun. My consciousness is already merging with the global frequency. Kaelen had only one option left. He dropped the pistol and grabbed the final wire connection. He had to complete the circuit and send the lethal power surge into the node before Thorne could touch the resonator. He had to risk killing himself and Reyes in the process. Kaelen didn't hesitate. With Thorne crawling maniacally toward the pulsating roots, Kaelen violently slammed the final wire onto the connection point. A thunderous, blue-white surge of electricity erupted from the node, the thousands of volts screaming into the sympathetic resonator. The entire petrified stump reacted instantly. Flames of pure, raw energy shot out of the wound, engulfing the ancient wood. The air filled with the acrid stench of ozone and burning organic matter. Adrian Thorne shrieked, not from the pain of the wound, but from the sudden, catastrophic destruction of his life's work. No. The signal. The transfer is broken. My frequency. You've ruined the resonance. The sheer force of the electrical discharge triggered a violent reaction in the tangle's unstable bedrock. The walls of the canyon began to groan and fracture, and the ground trembled beneath Kaelen and Reyes. Reyes! Get up. Now. Kaelen roared, scrambling toward her. He grabbed his partner and dragged her roughly across the shaking ground, pulling her away from the burning stump. The sound of ripping earth and cracking stone was deafening, drowning out Thorn's final, maniacal screams. They barely made it to a small, protected overhang as the canyon wall collapsed. Tons of earth, rock, and debris cascaded down, burying the burning sympathetic resonator, the smoking node, and the screaming, self-proclaimed, ultimate antenna, Adrian Thorn. In an instant, the ground shuddered once more and then settled into an eerie, absolute silence. The stench of ozone and smoke slowly drifted away. The frequency was silenced. The whisper box's reign of terror was over. Kaelen and Reyes lay exhausted under the overhang, covered in dust and ash. Kaelen reached out and gripped Reyes's shoulder, checking for injuries. It's over, Serena. We stopped him. We need to call Reynolds and clean up this mess. Reyes nodded slowly, her face etched with exhaustion and trauma. She stood up, brushing the dirt from her tactical gear, and retrieved her discarded shotgun. We stopped the broadcast, Miles. But I don't know if he stopped the contamination. Kaelen frowned. What are you talking about? The frequency is dead. The transmitter is buried. Reyes hesitated, her eyes fixed on the massive pile of rubble that marked the grave of Dr. Thorn and his tree. She slowly reached up and touched the side of her head. When Thorn hit me with the butt of the gun, I went down. But it didn't just knock me out. It felt like the control left, but something else took its place. She turned to Kaelen, her expression deeply troubled. I have a sound in my head, Miles. It's not tinnitus. It's a faint, continuous, high-pitched ringing. Kaelen felt a cold spike of dread. He remembered the diagram, the coiled ear, designed for absolute reception. The blow to my head, Miles, Reyes continued, her voice trembling slightly. It wasn't random. It was designed to jar something loose. It was designed to activate something. He didn't have time to perform surgery on you, Serena. It was the frequency controlling you, Kaelen insisted, trying to rationalize. What if the frequency didn't need the surgery, Miles? Reyes countered, her eyes searching his. What if the frequency was designed to find pre-existing physical anomalies? What if some people are naturally more receptive? She reached into the wreckage of the node and picked up the inert, warped brass crank of the whisper box. It was still hot, scarred, and silent. He called the 7 the beginning. He called me the 8th. When I was controlled, the instructions flowed right into my mind. I didn't have the coil, but I was listening all the same. She held the scarred crank in her hand, turning it slowly, carefully. This ringing, it's constant. It's not painful, but it's there. And it's tuned to a frequency that is completely silent now. But it's still receiving. Kaelen took a step back. The implications were horrifying. Thorn might be dead, the tree might be burned, but the legacy, the ability to create a receiver, might not have died with him. And Reyes might be permanently marked, waiting for the next signal. We need to get you to a hospital, a specialized facility, Kaelen urged. A hospital won't find a coil in my ear, Miles. And it won't find a sound that only I can hear, Reyes stated with chilling certainty. He won, Miles. Not with the broadcast, but with me. She looked back at the rubble. We need to go. We need to leave this place and pretend we found the bodies and close the case. If anyone, especially the department, finds out about the frequency, the coils, and this constant ringing, they will put me in a cage. Kaelen nodded, a wave of sickening understanding washing over him. The horror was not in the crime, it was in the aftermath. The perpetual threat. They hauled themselves out of the canyon. The sun was rising, casting pale light on the scene of utter destruction. They left the dead whisper box crank lying on the rocks. As they walked toward the dense forest, Kaelen risked a look back at Reyes. She was professional, silent, and deadly. But every few steps, she would subtly tilt her head, listening to the sound that only she could hear, the permanent ring. Weeks passed. The official report was a grim, convoluted narrative of mass murder and suicide, pinning the blame for the missing 7 and the subsequent chaos on Adrian Thorne. The deep quarry was declared a protected environmental zone, burying the truth of the sympathetic resonator forever. Kaelen and Reyes were hailed as heroes. But their victory was a lie sealed in silence and fear. They were back on active duty, driving the mundane, quiet streets of the city, but their car felt like a mobile cage. Kaelen watched Reyes constantly. She was sharper, more intuitive, almost unnervingly focused on details others missed. And every time the squad car slowed to a stoplight, she would subtly, almost imperceptibly, tilt her head, listening to the permanent, high-pitched ringing only she could hear. Kaelen tried to ignore the anxiety curdling in his gut. But then, he started noticing a sound too. It wasn't the high-pitched ringing. It was a faint, periodic click, a soft, mechanical sound, like a tiny relay switch closing. It had started subtly, only when he was exhausted, but now it was distinct, and the clicks coincided exactly with the moment Reyes tilted her head to listen. Kaelen gripped the steering wheel, his knuckles white. The whisper box was dead. The transmitter was buried. But the frequency had found a new, insidious way to communicate. He knew he couldn't talk to Reyes about it. She would deny it, or worse, see it as a validation of Thorne's legacy. Late one night, Kaelen accessed the cold storage lab where Thorne's recovered effects were stored. Most of the findings were mundane. However, hidden inside the lining of Thorne's lab coat, Kaelen found a small, sealed, glass vial. It contained a thick, synthetic, viscous liquid that smelled faintly of the sickly sweet floral scent he remembered from the node. The vial was labeled simply, ARS, Absolute Resonance Solution. A catalyst. Not a surgical tool, but a biological primer. Kaelen felt a wave of nausea. He hadn't touched Thorne or his tools, but he had handled the node's internal fluid when he was rigging the wires, and he'd been sprayed with the black fluid from the ruptured resonator. He hadn't just defeated Thorne, he had been contaminated. He found Thorne's final, water-damaged journal, recovered from the rubble. The last entry was half dissolved, but the critical lines were legible. The masterpiece is not the coil, but the priming. The ARS need not be invasive. A simple dermal application is sufficient for a 47.3 frequency jump. The ultimate receiver is not born, but made ready. If the broadcast is stopped, the ARS will retain the frequency in the host, awaiting the next transmitter. The detective handled the core. He is now the secondary receiver. The two will listen together, until the next great silence is broken. Kaelen's hands began to shake violently. The click in his mind intensified. Thorne hadn't needed to destroy the box's receiver status. He had simply ensured that the frequency would survive through its antagonists. Kaelen was the secondary receiver. Reyes was the primary, activated by the trauma of the gun butt. They were both primed with the ARS, and the frequency was now dormant within them, waiting. He knew what the click was. It wasn't Kaelen hearing Reyes's ring, it was the final, horrifying failsafe of the frequency. The ring in Reyes's head was her receiving the silent frequency, and the click in Kaelen's head was the signal confirming that the secondary receiver had successfully acknowledged the primary. They weren't free. They were linked. The next morning, Kaelen sat across from Reyes at their precinct desks. The office hummed with mundane noise, but Kaelen could only hear the nascent rhythm in his head. Miles, Reyes said, closing a file, her voice clipped. There's a new disappearance in Blackwood County. Not a hiker. A tech specialist who worked on microwave transmission arrays. Kaelen's blood ran cold.